use for agriculture, the water that may not be available for our communities, and how that's going to impact us in the future moving forward. So he'll start by sharing a little bit about his book, and then we also have two panelists to continue the conversation with him. So we have Minka Taharka, apologies, coordinator for the California Farmer Justice Collaborative. I'm really excited to have you here with us to share more of your insight on our local farmers, small farmers, and farmers of color throughout the Valley in California. And then Justine Massey, who is our policy manager and attorney for Community Water Center, and also our in-house Sustainable Groundwater Management Act expert, so all things groundwater and SGMA. And I'm going to stop there and kick it over to the people you want to hear from. But I think it's a small group, so really hoping that we can also have like Q&A, and as you have questions, just raise your hand or we can bring over a mic, and really looking forward to hearing from folks in the room.
Yes, thank you so much, Kelsey, and thank you guys so much for inviting me out here. This has been a very big day for me because I just met two sources who have taught me a lot about California and water today. I've talked to you a lot on the phone, but it's different to meet them face to face. Justine basically explained SGMA to me, and I was scandalized by what I learned from her. It didn't make it into the book, but I wrote an article after the book came out. It came out, I think, in the print magazine at the start of 2021. Sorry, it started 2022, but it came out online a couple months before that. Yeah. And I met Jesse from Self-Help Enterprises today, who has helped me understand the incredible environmental justice implications of what is going on here that have only gotten exponentially worse since we first spoke, I think in 2014, 8 years ago, during the last epochal historic drought. And so I just want to real briefly just discuss, I'm used to having my book somewhere close to me, but it's over there, but you can see the cover up there and over there too. So maybe I'll point to that thing as I think of it. But basically what I try to do in that book is propose that if you look at a plate of food in the United States, like let's say a dinner plate, what you're going to get, generally speaking, is probably some kind of meat and then some vegetables off to the side. And I had this kind of epiphany around 2014, 2015, when I was getting obsessed with the California drought and the troubles in the San Joaquin Valley. And I learned about a soil erosion event in the Corn Belt, where basically in the Corn Belt, the sort of Midwestern states in and around Iowa, where they grow, so basically, to go back to the plate metaphor, the fruits and vegetables on an American dinner plate tend to come from California, and the meat comes from corn and soybeans raised in the Midwest, if not also animals raised in the Midwest, but probably not out here. But so these are these two areas that really suffuse our food system. And when I looked into this erosion event that had happened in the Corn Belt and talked to some researchers there, what I realized is that area, which has an ecology as amazing and rare as the San Joaquin Valley, as unique as the San Joaquin Valley, it's a rare sort of grassland. It's one of the few major grasslands in the world that were derived over thousands of years of interactions between people and animals and weather patterns that created this incredible store of topsoil that was just this incredible treasure that the sort of settlers seized in the 19th century and brought under the plow. What I realized is that area is losing topsoil at 16 times the rate of replenishment. And I found that to just be, and this is just something that's going on and like everyone's acting like everything's normal. And I was just thinking, wait a minute, what I'm learning now is that California in the San Joaquin Valley, which has this incredibly unique and amazing ecology that also developed over millennia, interactions between people and weather and climate and animals. This area is drawing down its fossil water resource with incredible speed, so fast that the ground is literally sinking. And a similar thing is happening in the Corn Belt, and this is where we get our food. And so I thought, maybe I should write a book about this. Actually, previously I really just wanted to write a book about California, but this soil epiphany, and also my agent saying that I needed to broaden the scope a little bit. But this soil situation made me very enthusiastically mash these things up together in one book, and I remain just terrified actually by the way that this came out in 2020, and it's only more like the situations that I discuss in the book are only worse. The problems I discuss are only accelerating, and it's this essentially, really what we're seeing here is where settler colonial agriculture takes us. It takes us to the bottom. It takes us to the bottom of the soil. It takes us to the bottom of the aquifer, and basically extracts and concentrates the profits into a few hands. And there's something that my very brief introduction is about to end, but there's something I want to bring up. It's something we discussed right before. By far the most terrifying thing I've ever written is chapter 2 of this book. Chapter 2, and I want to get the Community Water Center to take on this. It might just be too much to think about, but what I learned that I found to be startling was there was this flood in 1861. This is right after U.S. statehood. U.S. statehood, I think, happened in 1858, if I'm not mistaken. Basically seizing it from Mexico after it had been seized by the Spaniards from the people who lived here. And there was this flood right afterwards that buried the entire Central Valley from the north extreme of the Central Valley to the south extreme in 10 feet of water. And basically completely rearranged agriculture in California, which had been basically cattle. It was basically like sort of Mexican ranchero, people from Mexico got American citizenship. People who lived here in this area got U.S. citizenship, and most of the land, a lot of the land that was under agriculture was ranchero cattle ranching, and then of course there were a lot of indigenous people living in the area at the time, but it was by today's standards fairly sparsely populated. So this, essentially rains for 40 days and 40 nights, straight out of the Bible, massive deluge, puts the whole valley under 10 feet of water, wipes out the cattle, wipes out those cattle ranchers. They basically lost their shirts and had to sell their land to U.S. settlers at pennies on the dollar. And what you got was a rearrangement where wheat takes over from cattle because it's a lot easier to plant some wheat seeds, and it's a lot cheaper to plant wheat seeds than it is to restock cattle. And so this event happens, it's cataclysmic, literally Sacramento's underwater. The governor had to go to his inauguration in a boat in 1862. And it's immediately forgotten about. And I've talked to, multi-generational Californians who never heard about it. But it turns out that climate change, the same forces that makes drought more likely and more of a new norm, and I kind of discussed the science behind this in the book, but what you get is fewer and more powerful storms, and there's this climate researcher named Daniel Swain at UCLA who has basically shown that a similar event to what happened in 1861-62 is more likely than not within the next 20 or 25 years. And the U.S. Geological Survey did a study, I think it came out in, I can't actually remember, but in the last 10 years, this U.S. Geological Survey study comes out, and they couldn't bring themselves to model a storm at the level of the 1861 event. they kind of pared it down, and they basically combined two storms that had happened. What would happen if we put them together? And it was just, the model was a lot less severe than the one that happened in 61, 62. And what they found was that if it happened, it would cause about $1 trillion worth of damage, and that's more damage in monetary terms than like a worst case big one earthquake, because it would just touch so much property and cause so much trouble. And of course, the Central Valley is now highly populated, lots and lots of people. Fastest growing cities in California are in the valley. Obviously the dairy industry has all these enormous, giant animals. I talk in the book about, the enormous weight of a modern dairy cow versus a cattle in the 19th century. So something like 1.5 times as big. There are more of them. Chemicals, pesticide, massive amounts of oil production in the southern San Joaquin Valley. It would just be a mess that is almost beyond imagination. There was a near dam busting that happened a little bit north of here a few years ago, and I'm forgetting the specifics, but it's in the book. But let's just say that when this dam almost busted and they had to evacuate this huge community, it did not go very well. There were, people like the highway became a parking lot, and so it just, I don't know, it's very terrifying to me. And it's something that, I think about like, how would you evacuate a city like Fresno? And also, what are the plans for the kind of communities that we talk about, that we're talking about tonight in the San Joaquin Valley? Like, what sort of evacuation plans can there be? And it's just not something. I feel like I'm just bringing everyone down by talking about it, but it does haunt me. And so having thrown that out there, I want to switch the conversation into thinking a little bit, first of all, about Sigma. And one thing I learned, like everyone else when it came out, I was shocked that it happened. It happened in the middle of my research. That I didn't think California would ever regulate groundwater, but then it did, and it did it in such a sort of Rube Goldberg contraption kind of way that with this long time horizon, that I was pretty cynical about it. But talking to Justine for that article, I realized that there is actually a lot of good stuff that's in the law, and it is in the law that communities and small users are considered people that have to be protected going forward. So, Justine, I wonder if we could just talk a little bit about Sigma and how it's going and what its potential is if democracy can be brought into the process. What its potential is for conserving water for communities when there's these giant, almond trees all around that are very thirsty and very lucrative.
Should I grab this one? Sorry, what?
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Well, first, I just want to agree that that flood is so scary, and it also blew my mind when I heard about it. And I think that it connects well to our discussion around Sigma because we're living at a time when these things that, as you put it, create a mess almost beyond imagination, are very real present risks, right? Whether it's an excess of water, whether it's emptying out aquifers that had filled up over thousands of years. Those are the stakes of our time. So, as you were saying, Sigma was established in 2014, and it really brought up many stakeholders together to make that happen because people all finally realized there isn't going to be water for anyone if we don't start regulating ourselves, basically. And so now the question has been, what does that look like? It's in part sort of delegated out to local groups to find a way towards balancing what comes out of the aquifers, right, where water's stored underground naturally in the soil, and then what goes back in through what's called recharge, and that's how the water got there in the first place, right? Kind of slowly trickling down after rain events, from lakes, from rivers. And along the way, we need to be preventing more harm, to put it simply. The term is like there's 6 undesirable results, but basically we need to stop letting water levels just fall dramatically, and make sure that water quality doesn't get messed up with the way that the water is moved around, whether that's through pumping or through recharge projects. Also trying to address land subsidence, like you alluded to, right? The actual land is sinking. I think that definitely goes into a mess that's almost beyond imagination. And then on the coast, seawater intrusion, right? So you have less fresh water keeping the ocean out, basically, and that can ruin your supplies too. As you said, there's a provision in SGMA that says that these local agencies must consider all beneficial uses and users, which include domestic wells and disadvantaged communities, as well as, of course, agricultural uses. And that's really what I want to focus on for a moment, is, if you'll humor me, like this little display of why there can be tension within that requirement, because there are different stakes for those different stakeholders. I don't know the best way to do this so that the camera can catch it.
I can pump.
You can pump? Okay. Well, so just to explain this is like very homemade. But I've got a little cup with some water in it. I have a very short, narrow straw to represent a domestic well, and it's just sort of barely in the water, because who would have the means to dig a well 1,000 feet down if it's just, their little family's well? And then there's an agricultural well that is more powerful. It's meant for industrial uses, and it goes a lot farther down. And then, okay, try to catch it. Okay. It's gonna squirt pretty high, okay. Like that. Okay, so you get this powerful pump as we're irrigating land. And basically, very few physical limits to those pumps. And you have to imagine, as Tom has said, this is happening throughout the valley, right? The demand is very, very great, especially in times of drought, because there's more use of groundwater than surface water. Okay, I think maybe I've done it.
Yeah, so like,
okay, it's bare. No, wait. Let's do it. Let's get it all the way dry. Okay. So the domestic well is just barely hanging on there. Residents might be experiencing sand in their water, low water pressure. Water might only be available at certain times of day. And then at a certain point, the water clears the well and they can't reach it at all, which I think we're there now. Okay. We've done it. Thanks, guys. I don't know if that was exciting for people in the audience.
It was exciting.
Yeah, yes, someone's excited. Thank you. So obviously this sets up a difference between those stakeholders, right? One interest, they really just want more water, because that's how they benefit their business, that's how they maintain what they've built, right? And this interest needs faster action. They need to make sure that the water levels don't drop. They're also more susceptible to water quality changes. So that's part of why there's this debate around how quickly changes need to happen within Sigma, and who all needs to be at the table because of that gap. And of course, at Community Water Center, we emphasize that the human right to water is at stake for this smaller domestic well. And as much as someone might want to compromise, at a certain point, you have to keep that well functioning in order for people to have access to drinking water. So I'll conclude with that for now, but thanks all.
So one of the things I talk about in the book is that we need to scale down California agriculture. It can't be this thing that feeds everyone, almonds every day, or even fruits and vegetables. We can't rely on getting as many of them from California as before, so we need to scale up local agriculture in other places. But California needs to feed itself. And so Minka, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what a younger generation of people who want to be on the land, who want to feed their communities, who want to feed their neighbors, what are the challenges that young folks are facing in this context of a settler colonial economy that has basically systematically iced anyone out who's not, at this point, white and has a lot of money to continue running this enormous pumps.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you both for being here with me today. Thank all of y'all for being here. My name is Minka. I'm here representing the California Farmer Justice Collaborative. This conversation is so interesting because it's very meta in the sense that right before this panel began, I was speaking with Becky, who was talking about how she was so excited about a person who's representing her community being in one of these governmental boards, one of these districts. And that's precisely what we're talking about when we speak on this conversation of what it looks like for small domestic well users, for underrepresented, socially disadvantaged farmers and populations to be part of these conversations. Are we in the room? Are our voices being heard? And if so, who's there and how are they showing up? What resources are able to bring them to the table? California Farmer Justice Coalition, Collaborative, CFJC is a really pivotal organization in the sense that it's this beautiful amalgam of people who came together to formalize this act called the Pharma Equity Act. Now, when we talk about equity, what does that conversation really mean? Like, many people have tons of different definitions of equity, and because we're not always on the same page, it'll look different for many folks. So how do we find a way, which the Pharma Equity Act essentially does? It builds a pathway by formalizing the definition of what a socially disadvantaged farmer is. That's really pivotal in our history, in the history of California and really of the United States. So when we think of these concepts, like we're using all this terminology that in itself divides us sometimes from understanding where we're coming from. So then when we decide that we want to approach a situation or approach an issue or a problem, sometimes we're not speaking the same language, literally, by just the terms we're using, or some, speaking Spanish. Sometimes I think it takes us a moment to step back and reflect before we move forward. So when you ask this question of how do you get involved, we have to look at what the system looks like right now. In our farming infrastructure, most of our farmers, most of our agricultural workers are approaching elderhood. And so when you imagine the future of farming, there's not many systems in place to encourage the younger generations and the new generations to think of farming as attractive. When I talk about this with some of my colleagues, we say, how can we make farming sexy again? How can we incentivize people to recognize that if you eat food and drink water, you need to be in this conversation. We're at a point where there's no going back. You know, what you spoke on earlier, the dam, Oroville Dam, that is connected to the really integral veins of our water system throughout California. That event wasn't something, what was actually a really good, a good example of how the people who experience the brunt of these ecological issues are BIPOC folks, are Black, Indigenous, Latino folks, or melanated farmers, melanated communities in these small areas that don't have a lot of representation, don't have a lot of resources, because of the legacy of settler colonialism and how it has translated and built not just our agricultural system. So when you began speaking on like needing to diversify or open up the topics of your book, it's because you can write volumes because of how interconnected and interdisciplinary what we're talking about is. Since everybody needs food and water to survive, it doesn't matter what you're doing. You can be the photographer, or you can want to make tablecloths. You need food. We need to be re-examining our relationship to production in many ways when it comes to agricultural products. And the rules and guidelines that have historically set the terms for us have ostracized a huge group of people who are doing the bulk of the labor. So when we talk about these bills and we ask these questions of, how can we make sure that they're in the room? How can we make sure that we're acknowledging the socially disadvantaged folks? Well, a lot of us know the answer already. A lot of the answers are already there. Many of these people from these communities have been screaming. I'm gonna say it 3 times because the amount of, the importance of this being a multi-layered issue. There's a long history of oppression that has affected the emotional, spiritual, physical, mental well-being of people. Okay, so then when you ask them, just come to this board meeting, or come be part of this panel, or come, engage in the conversation, what barriers are there to people being able to feel seen, to feel heard, to know that there are actors in these governmental and state agencies that are going to actually listen to them, not treat them as an accessory, not treat their opinions and their perspectives as something that is secondary or less than. And so when, in my opinion, and as I've seen and as I've spoken to many of these folks, that's really what it boils down to. Equity looks like making sure, in particular, that the racial dynamics that have built this system of inequality are put at the forefront, so that we're not, reproducing the same violences that created the issues in the first place. So that we don't have to spend a whole lot of time asking ourselves the same question over again. Many of us really just need to be, directly related to the resources, so that way we can implement the shifts that we already have been doing. When we think about these large agricultural entities and how they utilize their power to essentially, bully and, what's the word? Exacerbate the issues that they will sometimes patronize smaller communities by not really looking at the bigger issue, not really understanding that people need to live and survive and make their, go about their daily lives. We all have a right to survive, and it shouldn't be something that if you have money, you're only able to do the things that you enjoy doing, or only if you have money, you can access water. But unfortunately, the way that these systems are set up, there's an incentive for people to just continue to produce, and continue to produce without consequence. So part of the solution looks like de-incentivizing those programs, de-incentivizing those systems that are in place, and saying no to these large lobbyists that are looking at farmland as an asset rather than a necessity. Because we're facing this in so many different sectors, whether it's housing, whether it's food, this same type of extractive response is hurting us all around. So I'll conclude there.
Well, one of the things that I think about, farmland as an asset, this idea that I tease out at length in the book, when I think about that, and then I also think about the problem that you talked about of the aging farmer base, the injustice that has put farmland into, not just in California, but all throughout the United States, has put farmland into a very, 97% of US farmland is owned by white people. And when I put those two things together, and literally hedge fund managers and Bill Gates and just the wealthiest people in the world are seeing this as something that they have to balance their portfolios or to avoid inflation or whatever. I think the only way to break that chain, and I think it's actually related to Sigma and the giant pump versus the little straw, it seems like some kind of land reform in the United States. And I think as not the entirety of reparations, but as part of reparations. And I wonder, what you think about that. Is that something that people on the ground are thinking about? And have you interacted with this Cory Booker idea, the Justice for Black Farmers Act? Have you looked into that? Because it would, of course it's completely solved in the Senate, but it would allocate $5 billion a year to buy farmland in the open market, so it's not like anyone's getting their land seized, but redistribute it to people of color. And what about a social move? Is the social movement moving in that direction of we need resources to break this chain, or that pump is just going to keep on doing its thing?
Yeah, you have to. We definitely need to support this idea of reimagining what the agricultural landscape can look like, which literally means shifting how it actually is set up, which is, maybe not going to make our almond lobbyists happy, but we have literally finite resources. And I don't think that we are prepared to, be fighting each other for water, but that's happening in other places in the world already. So when we recognize where we are right now, that's why, scaling down the size of these farms, scaling down the levels and metrics of production is really important to being able to shift the resources needed to even produce food, because we don't even need the thousands of dollars and all the time and energy that is being put into these large-scale farms. They end up wasting a lot of the resources that they have taken from people who could more adequately use them. And so there's really an issue with greed and overuse, and capitalism and settler colonialism exacerbate that, and they incentivize it. They create terms that, like you said, big investors want to add farmland assets to their portfolios. So it's not really even about the produce that they're growing. It's not about the land. It's really about, you know, cushioning themselves for something else. But we're in a dire situation because California produces such an important percentage of the nation's food. And in order for us to even be able to produce food for ourselves, we have to make these shifts happen now, which means encouraging some of these like larger institutions to put pressure on some of these larger agricultural entities, so that way they're not as able to, like I mentioned earlier, bully these smaller farmers by just having more resources. Because when I talk to small farmers in Fresno who've been farming for 3 generations, who are struggling because they've been farming and they want to continue farming to be able to pass it over to their children, but because their wells are drying up, they don't know if they'll be able to even take out a loan to drill it deeper.
They're in the same.
They're in that same situation, and there's so many people who are in that situation who end up getting pushed out. So by reframing, restructuring what our farming system looks like, it'll be a radical shift, but it is what's needed in order to ensure that we have a future.
Justine, one of the things I learned from talking to you for that story was there's this potential in Sigma, because I think after some struggle, they acknowledged that sort of micro users, communities, individual well owners have to be considered under Sigma. It's in the law. But he also drove home to me that it tends to be these wealthy interests, the guys that run the big pumps, who dominate these GSAs up and down the valley. And I'm wondering, are there efforts, is it possible, is it in the realm of imagination to democratize these GSAs? Is that something that's happening? And how can that be sped up?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one issue is that de minimis users is the term, right? So it has the word kind of minimum in there. That means people who use 2 acre-feet per year of water. So you can picture water spread out on an acre, a foot high. That's an acre-foot. Anyone who uses 2 acre-feet per year or less of water is considered a de minimis user. And basically, you're not supposed to limit how much they use because it's, a drop in the bucket. But that also means that sometimes they get left out of the conversation because they don't have to make a change in their own use. And I think that's just, a problem that happens.
Especially when it's the water they drink and
yes,
they use to survive.
That's the thing, is even though they're using very little, it's extremely critical that they have access to that amount. And I think sometimes that gets lost in the rush to try to make decisions about very vast quantities of water. So that's a problem there. And as with so much of our society and so many of the problems that we have nowadays, it goes back to what you've been alluding to, right? Of we have this pattern of extraction, over-extraction. In environmental spaces, we use terms like tragedy of the commons, right? Everybody wants to use some, but nobody wants to deal with the consequences of those resources getting exhausted. It's also referred to as externalized costs in economics speak. So it's a very real cost, but that doesn't get included in the math usually when people are sort of crunching the numbers. The ways to fix that are to increase representation. that can be difficult because there's that feedback loop of folks who have already benefited from this system of extraction, then have the resources to, know that there's an opening on a board or something like that. They may have supportive staff in their other endeavors, so they can afford to go to a meeting in the middle of the day, or anyway, lots of ways to describe those kinds of advantages. But I think that's a key role that groups like ours play, is to try to get the word out, offer support so that those spaces do not feel as exclusive. And of course, that's a responsibility that these local agencies, the GSAs, groundwater sustainability agencies, share. That's part of it, is getting them to embrace that role. I will say one other challenge is that a lot of decisions are made by majority rules. And that's like a very commonly used strategy, right? Seems like it would make sense, but if you just have one representative there to represent,
But I believe we had a question. This gentleman right here. Do you want that microphone?
No. I speak loud enough.
Hi, Tutui.
Hello, my name is Tutui. I'm here from Visalia, right down the street, a little ways. Grew up in the north side here, Visalia. So I've been listening, and I'm gonna go to my spirit person, old man Gil Reese. I'm gonna say he kissed me a minute ago, or a little while ago, and he's back, And I say kiss because he was telling me, keep it simple, stupid. Keep it simple, stupid. Telling me, not the rest of you, but me. I'm listening to you all up there, and I'm a simple person, in a sense, I don't always keep it simple, and so I can get myself all caught up in confusion. I see California Perilous Bounty. I haven't read much about it, and so I'm considering, is that bounty water that we're talking about? You know what I'm saying? Is it water that we're talking about here today? I somewhat understand what each of you have already, mentioned, but it can get real complicated for a person like me, and other people like me. So what do I want to say? What is my point, right? When Justine was doing, and you, Tom, were doing the little example there, I was like, okay, take a drink of the straw now. Right? And you can suck on that straw all you want, there ain't gonna be no water. And when you talk about the flood, the great flood, that was a history. I want to look that up now, you know what I'm saying? It covered all of California, but then you go back to when they started building dams, and then you mentioned the Oroville situation, so, that Perilous Bounty is also the land, talking about farming stuff and all this, ain't gonna matter. It ain't gonna matter, in my simple mind, if we continue with the climate, and I'm gonna use climate change stuff, believe it or not, but, for me, it's a reality. It's there, right? And we ain't gonna have that bounty. Or if we do, it's gonna be too much, and if something, took place like that, then it ain't gonna matter what California can feed. They ain't gonna be able to feed nobody, right? And you already mentioned in other parts of the United States, and you mentioned even in the world, you know what I'm saying? things that are taking place. So my simple mind says, you know, focusing on what's taking place with the drought now, the climate changes that, you know, one extreme to another, right? And what we're doing about that. Besides the fact that the resources, because money talks, and I don't mean to offend anybody, bullshit walks. That has been in our culture, you know, for many years, okay? And then when we, or for myself, when I consider, you know, if that's the case, then there's gonna be a point where resources, right? The people that have the money are gonna have access to that resource. The people that don't, they're shit out of luck, excuse my language. And that's all I wanted to say about that. Thank you.
Well said. Any other questions out there? Yes.
I don't have a question. I do have some comments. I heard mentioned that about a lot of farmers are at that age where we're going to be losing farmers. I gotta disagree with that. For about 30 or 40 years, every school throughout the valley has a program called FFA, Future Farmers of America. I got a couple of granddaughters that's involved in that, and they're out there doing everything to learn about farming. I don't see it going away. As a matter of fact, I don't think that we have very small farms here around the area. The problem that I see with water is the abuse and waste of water. We all know that our aquifers are being depleted. And what do I see? From Bakersfield all the way up to, let's see, Stanislaus. Trees are being planted by the acres, thousands and thousands of acres. You know how much water it takes to go ahead and water one tree? And they take them out and they plant more. And you take a look at the fields, you can go out there right now, and they flood the fields, okay? Because there's no limit as to how many wells a farmer can have. I was at a city council in Tulare. I live in the city of Tulare. And when they were talking about some of the ordinances that they were gonna put into effect about, we're gonna put you guys on stage 1 or stage 2 or stage 3, which is gonna limit how much water the residents, the people that live there, can actually have. There's no limit to, we had a person that lived there, he's a farmer, he said, I'm gonna go out and drill 4 more wells because they have the means. And if you got the means, you can do whatever you want. And the other thing is that there's nobody to go ahead and monitor how much water is being used and how much is being wasted. You can make all the rules you want, you can make all the laws you want, but if nobody monitors and enforces them, it's going to continue to go ahead and be abused. In the city of Tulare, if you go ahead and if you use more than 9,000 gallons of water per household, your next amount is going to be raised. If you go ahead and water on the days that you're not designated, you're going to get fined, okay? But there's an exemption for public agencies. They can water whenever they want, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, have the water running down the streets. And it's okay because they have an exemption. So, you know, you make rules and we make rules and they're being made by our elected representatives, but there's always an exception. And all it takes is you pay a fee for an application and you can go ahead and be exempt from the rules. We have too much waste and we don't have nobody monitoring or holding people accountable for the waste that's going on. And we're gonna continue to go that route until, as mentioned earlier, once that straw dries up, and it has, we have communities around the city of Tulare where the water was, you couldn't drink it. And then when they wanted to be hooked up to the city of Tulare, it was a big fight. You know, we can't help our neighbors, that's ridiculous. We had one city councilman that said, we don't want people like that in our city, okay? But eventually the state stepped in and that community got hooked up. Okay, we're having the same problem in other communities also around the area. Instead of fighting, we ought to be trying to go ahead and resolve problems because in our Constitution in the state of California, everyone is guaranteed water, potable, drinkable water. And it's unfortunate that is not happening.
When I was writing an article that, reporting on an article that ended up in the book, I was in Alpa here in Tulare County, and I think it was 2015. The drought is raging, and Governor Brown at the time put restrictions, phase 1, 2, or 3, whatever it was. And in this farm worker town, people were told they couldn't water the lawns anymore. And walking around the town, what I saw was not any lawns. What I saw were fruit trees in people's yards that were this low-income farm worker town, and they were being told they could not water. There were regulations. The state was taking control of the drought. And then we drove not a mile from there into a pistachio field, and it was a complete free-for-all. And they were dropping wells and putting in pistachio saplings like it was no big deal at all. And it was just, I couldn't, it really sort of crystallized for me what the situation was, where there are harsh regulations in LA on water use when there's a drought. In cities which take a minuscule, I think the Resnick's almonds and nut trees in general command more water than the city of Los Angeles, which is just stunning. But regulation stops at the farm gate, apparently, and that's a very common thing across the United States. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I appreciate Tom and the panel this topic. And I can also appreciate that when you did the research for the book, it looked pretty bleak. I'd like to put a little bit of hope in because I think Sigma has been a massive paradigm shift. And I mean, it's hard to imagine as regulated as California is on everything that they never regulated their groundwater. We should have regulated it 50 years ago. But we did it. And you know, in farmers' defense, 30 years ago, farmers were being told, quit growing row crops, quit growing pasture, quit growing alfalfa, grow something more valuable. And they discovered the almond, they discovered the pistachio. And what we find out is that when you plant an orchard, it becomes a hard demand. Now, all that being said, Justine, your example there, when you get to the end of the cup, it's the end of the cup for the big guy too.
Exactly.
And we are getting to the end of the cup. And I got a lot of friends that are farmers. And they don't like the government just to begin with. And then when they complain about Sigma, I go, okay, have you guys spent any money on your wells in the last 3 years? Oh yeah. I mean, this is a disaster in the making for agriculture, and they know it. The good news here, and I really do think it's good news, in where we sit here in Visalia, the farmers who are farming right outside here in the Tulare Irrigation District are on an allocation system right now. It's implemented the 1st of May. Everybody else will be the 1st of October for the next season will be on a water budget. Are they monitoring it? Absolutely. This was the most amazing, coincidence, but the development of satellite technology has enabled, through satellites, to read the evapotranspiration signature off of every single field in California. And they are using this, these GSAs are using this to monitor and to budget and to check water usage against their budget and charge farmers for using, they pay for all their water in these GSAs that have adopted this. So they've adopted it in Kern County in semi-tropic area. Eastern Tule. There's a number of the Pixley Irrigation District, Lower Tule, GSA, Mid Kauai, Greater Kauai, Eastern Kauai. So in this South Valley, all of these farmers are now on water budgets that will be cranked down until we get to 2040, at which point they will not be allowed to take any more water out of the ground than what is sustainable. Okay? Now, that's a huge lift. Also, every single one of these GSAs received an incomplete from the state in January. They had 6 months to respond. They all responded last week. July 27 was the deadline. As far as I know, every one of them has adopted a commitment to protecting and assisting in providing supplemental water for domestic wells. Now, the details of that need to be worked out, and you folks need to be involved. We all got to be involved in making sure that we do that right. But there's been a very significant recognition by agriculture that we are in this together, and that we've got to do the right thing.
Justine had her son.
I think you're right to say that there's been progress. Yes, there are allocations or at least fee structures that are being put in place. There are some new methods for monitoring, and there is at least a reference in the newly submitted plans to what we call mitigating, or trying to lessen the impact to domestic wells. At the same time, it's that age-old issue of the devil's in the details, right? So some of those problems that we've seen continue throughout all of this time period that we've been talking about that led us to this point is that folks who have the means, maybe they can pay the penalty fees and it doesn't affect them. We kind of need to see the details of those programs that would help domestic wells in order to know if they actually will. And particularly because no individual can wait till 2040 to make sure that they have safe access to their drinking water. So I agree with you, but I think there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of adjustments that maybe people still aren't quite ready to see. We've alluded to some land repurposing. Some of those discussions are happening. We know that we can't have the status quo. And so, a lot of these local agencies, the discussions have been around kind of how can we keep the status quo for as long as possible, but yes, make some changes. Whereas I think at some point, I don't know how we make, turn the corner, but I think the conversation needs to be, how can we do this as quickly as possible and as equitably as possible?
And I'll just add that we are in an absolute emergency, and I was just talking to some sources at Self-Help Enterprises today, and they were explaining to me that last year, I believe they had 800 tanks out. So this is 800 people whose well went dry last year in 2021, and it was a record-shattering, I think it was above the peak of the previous drought. Incredible stress on that agency, on that group, even more stress on the people who are having to have a water tank hooked up to their house. And in 2022, what are we, the 4th of August? There are now 1,200 water tanks out. So this is, and by the time this, until winter comes, it could be 2,000, 2,500, and the budget that they've been given by the state, it's basically all the, it can support the wells, the tanks they have out right now, but there's no money for the next 1,000 tanks that are probably gonna have to come out. So this is an absolute emergency that we're talking about, and it's not 2035 or 2025, it's 2022. So this is already happening. And we know that this, you know, at some point we're gonna revisit the language of drought, because a drought sounds like an anomaly, it sounds like a thing that happens every few years, and it is emerging in this 22nd century of ours as more common than a good water year, and you know, way more common than that vanishingly rare thing, an average water year. But do we have any more questions? Yes. Well, yes, please. And you want the microphone?
No.
Okay.
My name is Becky, and I was living in the community of Seville. And our community just not too long ago got a new well. And a couple of years later, right across the street where the new well is, a guy comes in, a farmer, and plants acres of new trees. My 9-year-old grandson driving to my mom's house, says, "Why are they planting trees?" I go, "Well, the farmer's plan." Goes, "I thought there was a drought." I go, "Exactly." But I think we both agreed, is there needs to be a moratorium where no more farming for a while. Stop for a while till we can get some water, groundwater. I was telling now, Saudi Arabia, in their country, they stopped the dairy farmers from growing their hay. And guess where they came to grow their hay? In Arizona. Arizona. And I think just like our dairies here, they have to grow their feed for their animals, and they run their pumps 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Even when it's raining, I'm thinking, don't they know that it's gonna rain? I mean, I'm constantly checking the weather to plan my day out, but I think there should be a moratorium where we need to stop. I've seen, I have a lot of farm workers that work out in the fields, and they're saying, "Hey, they're knocking this field down. How come?" Because there's no money, and they're gonna start planting pistachios or almonds. Well, that's the almonds, 65% of their crop, 65% is exported. That's not feeding our country, the 65%. And I think that moratorium really needs to be, we need to come to a freeze, just like other communities where they want to build a house and it's like, "Oh, we can't, we have a moratorium, there's no, the sewer system doesn't have the capacity right now." So if they're stopping people from building a home, they need to stop some farmers. Let's just stop.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're getting at that SGMA is a major step forward. And when I was reporting, you know, in that period and talking to people, it seemed like holy writ that, oh, we can't regulate groundwater. And, you know, you got something through in 2014 that regulated groundwater, and it was, you know, a massive deal, but it's nowhere near enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think like when we bring up this conversation of like a redistribution or repurposing of land, there's also what comes with that, a redistribution of power and redistribution of resources, which is the other part that, you know, sometimes makes folks uncomfortable, because there has been a lot of waste. There's been a lot of unmitigated waste that certain people are allowed to waste, while other people don't even have their basic needs met. And so when we think of a magical solution, a lot of that just boils down to keeping it simple and taking these resources and these governmental entities that are used to pay the salaries and for folks to sit in meetings and talk in circles about things that we already know the answers to. We need to utilize these resources to, you know, support short-term and long-term solutions for a lot of these communities that are facing the brunt of these environmental issues. You know, that program that you spoke about, the FFA program, is that what it's called?
Yes.
That's amazing. Future Farms.
It's been going on for many, many years.
And see, I wish that, like, I grew up in Los Angeles, like, you know, and I wish that we had a program like that because, like I mentioned, you know, if we all need to learn how to grow our own food. That is an important method of reclaiming our power and our ability to sustain ourselves, which has been removed from us, has been taken from us as a way to control how we exist in the world. And that's really important to like solidify, because when we can grow our own food, that is a really potent, powerful skill that has been passed down through generations. And so keeping these practices alive is not just for making money, but it is how we, you know, we break bread together, we spend time on the farm together. Like these are you know, multifaceted ways that when we're talking about water, when we're talking about, you know, where our food is coming from, how it affects us on, you know, from a extrapolated to a very minute level. I just want to express just appreciation for being in this room with folks and being able to have discussions and dialogues like this, because this is what we need to be doing more. We need to be talking to each other. We need to be in the same room with our differing ideas, trying to cross these bridges and understand where our lived experience has allowed us to land in our understanding of what's next and what's to come. Because when those people are all stuck on that highway in their evacuation from the potential of the Oroville Dam breaking, we're all on the bridge. We're all on the bridge. And I mean, granted, you know, a lot of us are able to live in places that are not as susceptible, but we don't need to only come together in times of crisis. We don't need to wait until, you know, everything hits the fan and then we're all, you know, scrambling. Like, these things need to start happening now. So I'm just grateful that we can be here and know that, and not just, you know, I want to invite everyone to just like take a moment to be embodied inside. Go like this. Just stretch your jaw out a little bit. Because sometimes when we talk about these really intense issues, we clench up because it's scary.
Yes.
I can't imagine being on a highway stuck like that. No, I don't even want to imagine it, but it's real. So understand, like, get in your body. Like, I'm a big believer in getting in our bodies to be able to move through a lot of the emotional energy that comes up as we discuss these very real issues. So, yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. I think we're about to get there.
Yeah, I think we are at time. I think if you want to go to the next slide. We do have an ask for the room, but also would encourage you that if you're able to stick around and want to keep the conversation going, I mean, I think our panelists are going to hang out for a bit. We also have a few of Tom Smoke Perilous Bounty in the back, and I'm sure he'd be happy to talk about it with you and, and explain. I just wanted to put up here something that our group at Community Water Center put together as a way to make sure that more voices are heard in the groundwater space. We put together a petition so that we can really make sure that we're telling them we need to be protecting those who are reliant on wells for drinking water and for their human right to water when you're considering your groundwater plans. So if you don't mind, you don't have to while we're all doing this, but if you just grab your phone, if you can take a picture. If you have a phone, we can also take your name and we're happy to add you to the petition. But you just take a picture of that, it'll open up a link, and there'll be more information as well. We'd love to have you join us in asking that our groundwater plans are equitable and protecting those who are our most important users of the water beneath our feet. So that is it for today, but thank you all so much for being here, and again, we really encourage you guys to come up, keep the conversation going. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.